Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture, and also sports on Wednesday in our Foul Play segment, the very one we're embarking on right now. I'm Michelle Witte, joined today by Nate Wallace, creator and co-host of the podcast Redspin Sports. He's going to tell me everything I ought to know about paying college athletes, protesting at the Olympics and elsewhere, and the impact of youth sports. Although, Nate, I will tell you I know a little bit about that last one. Nate, thanks for joining me.
Hey, glad to be here, Michelle. Thanks for the invite.
I got to say, I'm pretty excited to kick back now and have you just tell me about this Supreme Court case that challenges the NCAA's limits on compensations for student athletes. It's going to do that by, I guess, challenging the NCAA, saying it violates antitrust laws. So tell me about this case and what hangs in the balance here.
Well, I mean, this has been something that really is tied to the name, image, and likeness issue. All right? And it's sort of a complicated one because in a lot of ways, the NCAA, it just seems totally against their interest to be digging their heels in on this because it's almost become totally mainstream to support that. The idea that you, as you own your name, image, and likeness, and you should be able to make money off of that, especially when these schools are making huge amounts of money off of player labor, especially the larger Division I level, and that especially you think men's basketball and football particularly. But they just continue to dig their heels in and are terrified of the notion of any challenge to amateurism. I found it interesting last week, and we talked about this on By Any Means Necessary, how Barack Obama is going on a lot of podcasts, a lot of shows, and along with Bakari Sellers, who is really like a hitman for the Democratic Party and the establishment against any kind of progressive elements, going on the Ringer show, Bill Simmons' podcast, and talking about, support for paying players. And, it's like Obama is one of those guys, the characters who just everything he does is so calculated. It's like a way where he can show some sort of solidarity, but by not doing it on an overall mass level. But it's still, even on that sort of stuff, it's hedged. See, the issue with what's going on at the Supreme Court is, all right, it's name, image, and likeness, which is great. That should be legal. But it also totally absolves universities and those institutions of any kind of responsibility. They can say, now you can go and get money for having a nightclub, do a promo for you, or use your picture on posters or whatever it may be, or a car dealership. But it's really the long-term healthcare stuff that I really think is the crux of this, and it's what the resistance to the biggest change, big kind of changes really stands.
Let me ask you to parse these two things out. So this case is about, can student athletes have control of their own image and likenesses and market themselves and make money off that? It's not about paying them for the work that they are doing, right? So what is this aspect of healthcare that comes into it?
Well, it's not specifically relevant to this. I was just, dropping that in there as a larger part of the issue in general. The reality, though, is that the healthcare plays in at a much broader level, and the fact that universities want to get the liability of healthcare costs off their books as quickly as possible, and that is something that and a lot of the long-term effects of injuries sustained. I'll use college football as an example. At that level, do not manifest themselves right away, and then or you're stuck with a lifetime of having to deal with that. While the NCAA is saying, "Well, we provided you with a college education, right? And you had to kind of just sacrifice all this other stuff as part of that." But yeah, the name, image, and likeness stuff is purely a way of saying that, hey, you can go make money off of this. But what's wild is, even though that's become not even a controversial position, really, that the NCAA is still, it's like they're terrified of giving up an inch, or do they feel like that they're in a bunker mentality, I think is what it is, really. And that's what we're up against. And it's ironic that I think that it's actually going to help kind of accelerate their undoing, especially when it comes to a schism within the biggest college football schools, the big revenue schools, and that. I think we're heading to a break where they're going to kind of establish their own league with their own kind of rules that are different from the rest of the NCAA. Because, the NCAA could serve a purpose on Division II, Division III level sports where, just an administrative role. There has to be some kind of organization overseeing that. But it's just a joke when it comes to these big sports that have national platforms that are, multi-million and even billion-dollar industries. And the notion of that is just amateurism. The whole notion of amateurism goes back to a history of, gentlemen and wealthy people, like acting as if like sport is just a game and it's silly, just something we do to help like take boys to men sort of thing. So it's really tied up in a really dubious history, and it just reveals so much about the NCAA that they can't even give in on something that should be it should be just common sense, and it is on really on a mass cultural level now.
I feel like also the sort of nebulousness of this concept of amateurism is probably best expressed in the case of Jim Thorpe, right? Who had his medals stripped because he had violated some very obscure provisions. Like he had sort of played for fun, but got a little money from a couple different teams, and they decided that was reason enough to strip him of his medals. So yeah, the whole concept of amateurism is constantly being tested, I feel, Nate. And of course, that does kind of bring us to the Olympics here. I'm sure you saw this Color of Change petition going around that brought up the case of Gwen Berry, an American athlete who said she's being punished. She's been dropped by corporate sponsors. She's been excluded from grants after she raised a fist in protest at the Pan American Games. And now, I guess, the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee announced that they're no longer going to punish athletes for protesting, and that they're going to push the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, to end their ban on racial justice protests, which is enforced under this Rule 50. So I actually hadn't realized that protest at the Olympics was banned. And it is funny to think about what the Summer Olympics in Tokyo might have looked like if they had been held this year, especially during this wave of very intense protest in the United States. So I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about protest in international sport and what kind of appetite you think we're going to see for it, even at Tokyo 2021?
I mean, I think it's going to be big. I think it's yet to be determined, I guess, in terms of how quickly the vaccine's rolled out, how effective it is, in terms of how big of a spectacle that'll be, whether it can really go on. I mean, I think that, and then we've got on the horizon, don't forget about our 2022 corrupt World Cup is going to be in Qatar. It's
right.
Modern day slavery on the horizon. So we got a lot of good things to look forward to. But nonetheless, I mean, I think you need to go back to Mexico City, 1968, and just look at Tommie Smith and John Carlos and their Black Power solidarity fist. Really, they were like the lead up to it, like constantly they were going back and forth on what they wanted to do with that platform. Of course, you have to actually end up on the podium to make, so they had the whole thing of like, hey, well, we better end up medaling, so we have that platform in the first place. But the way that they were stripped of their medals, the rhetoric against them. I mean, Tommie Smith recovered a little bit more. I mean, Carlos is like, it's affected his life in major ways, like, even till the present. And there's a lot of, I would encourage people to research that. I mean, he was the bronze medal winner, and Tommie Smith won the gold. And that's kind of a context of like how the U.S. Olympic Committee in particular really has draconian measures in place to keep their athletes in line, because for the U.S., the Olympics are very political. Like in the context of the Cold War, there's a lot of scholarship that's done on this. The U.S. wanted to present like a very, just like a State Department like projection of what the U.S. is like to the world, freedom, democracy, this is where everyone wants to be. So if you allow protest, that contradicts that whole narrative and how politicized that is. And it's funny because they always want to talk about East German, like, swimmers that aren't really female, right? They're taking male hormones, all this other nonsense. So that's the context. And I think we need to really support, athletes that are challenging that. And it was for Gwen Berry to be putting this petition around, I think is really significant. And I think that it deserves our attention and support for people that are trying to fight these larger causes, because it's only through pressure and demands that power does anything. And that's corporate power too.
I wonder also if you see any significance in the fact that Gwen Berry is a woman. And we have seen a lot of athletes celebrated for their protest finally. I mean, of course, we've also seen a lot of athletes really lose their careers, Colin Kaepernick, to speak of one, over protesting. But it has become something that is celebrated, right? It's become something that isn't necessarily shied away from. But it does seem like it's men who are more celebrated for it than women are. And I think like the example of the WNBA is a really illustrative one. Women's basketball has been, pretty militant in terms of racial justice for a long time. I think women's soccer has also been a lot more united in standing up for racial justice issues and others for a long time. And yet, who do you hear about? You hear about it when it's somebody like LeBron James making a stand. You hear, we had this huge amount of praise for Patrick Mahomes for just saying Black Lives Matter, And so it's like, is there a double standard here when it comes to gender?
There's absolutely a double standard. It's absolutely just tied into the patriarchal nature of this country and a legacy of that. I mean, for all the talk about Title IX in the college level and issues of equity, I mean, we live in a capitalist society where it's like market-driven forces, right? And so it's like they're all, and what they'll say to people in these industries is that, oh, well, we're just responding to consumer demand. But, I mean, how you frame stuff and how people are brought up and conditioned to be plays a major role into that too. There's the whole idea of even like to bring it back to the Olympic stuff with like the gender difference. You had within the Eastern Bloc countries and the Soviets, like they've really emphasized like women's emancipation and like to be the best they could be. Whereas for the longest time, really until recent years, the U.S. Olympic Committee was very focused on presenting like a model kind of like feminine, athletes that are, in gymnastics, synchronized swimming and stuff that fit the sort of like ideal, westernized, feminine, what woman did they want to project as like, in contrast to like the, just all the stereotypes of like the East and everything that you hear.
Be the greatest athlete in the world, but also be conventionally beautiful. That's the idea.
And you also did it at the WNBA. I think that's one area where I think there is some encouraging progress. I mean, Sue Bird has gotten a lot of attention for the stuff she's done with the Seattle Storm. I think that Maya Moore and getting an innocent man like taken freed from prison this past summer and like literally like taking the season off of the WNBA was something I think did get a lot of attention, not as much as it should have, but I think that, and then also the players of the Atlanta Dream collectively in the WNBA and pushing back against their just bigoted, racist, and also just completely criminal owner who's she's either 49% owner or half and half, but Kelly Loeffler, who's running for Senate in Georgia now. And I'm here down in visiting family in Jacksonville, Florida. We're right on the border with Georgia. I'm being bombarded during almost every commercial break with her commercials now, so I'm about to lose my mind. But the players ran a team, and they're wild too. It's like Raphael Warnock is a Castro-loving socialist preacher. They're doing the whole Jeremiah right. Yeah. You gotta love it. But yeah, they really took a stand against her. It was embarrassing. They weren't able to force her to sell, but they really, I think, got a lot of attention and used the bubble this summer that they had of their own to really attract attention. There has been a lot of media coverage on that. It's just that getting on a mass level people to care at the same level. And also, I think the solidarity NBA players have shown with the WNBA is powerful. The late Kobe Bryant played a on that too. So I think it's important to note that a lot of the people that are most progressive in pushing the importance of WNBA and how talented these women are actual NBA players. It's the fans that a lot of times are holding back on progress in that kind of arena.
And Nate, while I have you for another couple of minutes, as someone who obviously you did sports as a young man, you work with young people now, and the Washington Post had this really sad story last week about teen suicide during the pandemic, and in particular, the suicides of some young athletes over the course of this year. It reminded us that youth suicide is already at a record high. It was increasing every year between 2007 to 2017. And the CDC had done a survey recently asking young adults whether they'd thought about killing themselves in the past 30 days, and 1 in 4 said they had. They also found intense feelings of anxiety and depression among teens, and a marked decrease in physical activity. And of course, I think, we all know there's a lot of connection between physical activity and mood. So sometimes this data is being used to push for schools to reopen or for youth sports to reopen separately. And I think those are complicated questions. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on them as someone who remains pretty close to them and close to the importance of sports for young people.
Yeah, I mean, I feel very conflicted on this. First of all, as someone who's an educator and a union activist, I think that we need to keep a united front. But I'd be lying if I said I don't have concerns about what the effects of this virtual learning is doing, especially on the most impoverished and least resourced children. I mean, kids who are from middle class, especially upper middle class backgrounds, I think handle this fine. They get to kind of have plenty of space at home. But I just know from a teaching perspective, dealing with kids in inner city Section 8 housing situations and just like housing instability and all sorts of crazy stuff going on now. That they are really struggling. They're in tight spaces, and especially in big cities like where I work in Jersey City, and it's really, really tough. I mean, I know that with sports, it's highly politicized, so it's hard to really have a rational conversation about this without people making assumptions of what your politics are. And of course, the rights but there has to be a distinction between wanting to reopen in order to help the mental health, to help for the benefit of the students and also the athletes, because I think the youth sports angle of it is big. I think youth sports are safe. It's just the difference is it's the commercial aspect of then trying to reopen sports for the benefit of big money-making, profit-making teams of professional organizations, and especially the free labor we see in college sports. But I do have major concerns with the idea of just keeping. I mean, I think the mental health issue is very real, and it breaks down very much on class lines. And I don't know. And I think that there's a lot of data. It's all over the place, but I don't know. It's something I am conflicted on. But I think you cannot ignore what this pandemic has done. And I hate to sound like I'm parroting like the lines of some of these right wingers, but it does have an effect on the most vulnerable. And that's really an indictment of capitalism more than anything else, that's what happens when we need to do what we need to do to stay healthy.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a tendency to try and treat people as only minds or only bodies and forget that they go together. And I think, there's certainly some young people who are obviously slowly losing it in these confined spaces. And I think it does behoove us to find a way for them to get outside, find a way for maybe allow some of these sports to be open for kids to join voluntarily. And I do think, we can very clearly see who is being served when we look at the fact that college basketball is playing now. Players are playing for free, making money for these schools. And yet, youth sports that don't turn a profit, no, absolutely not. They've got to be the last priority. I think that is a really good point. Nate Wallace of Redspin Sports, where should our listeners go to find you when you're not on Radio Sputnik?
Absolutely. I'm on Twitter at Nate Wallace 9. That's at Nate Wallace, the name, and then the number 9. And then at Redspin Sports. We got a lot of stuff recorded. I need to get to work on getting edited and getting out now. We had some really good discussions on baseball type stuff. We got a podcast with Abdul Malik out I released, who's a Canadian writer, who's a piece in Jacobin about how luxury sneaker markets are like kind of a preview of the capitalist dystopia. It's actually a pretty interesting conversation. So we got a lot of stuff in the works, and actually recorded a thing about Diego Maradona with an activist down in Argentina, Esteban, and who's worked with Ben Norton and the Gray Zone people, and Esteban Almiron, his name is, and we talked about the media slander of Diego Maradona and what it really says about the class dynamics of that, and how they aren't holding a lot of the athletes that don't challenge imperialism to those kind of standards, and especially trashing on him posthumously like we've seen since his passing. So those are some things we're working on, and you also, if you want to support us on Patreon, that'd be great. Trying to grow that a little bit too. I need to get some more stuff up on there, but that's it. At Redspin Sports on Twitter too.
And I'll keep my eyes open for all of those things to come. Happy holidays, Nate. Always great to hear from you. And of course, you heard him today on Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik. We're live in DC. We'll be back right after this.